Alright, this is the project walkthrough for the Lambda Calculator project. We're going to be taking a look at how I would break down trying to approach and solve this before we actually do any of that solving. So what we're given is our calculator design. Obviously the first step would be to read the entire README, but that's not super enthralling video, so I'm not going to do that here. What we are going to do is we're going to take a look at this calculator. I'm going to talk about how I would approach breaking this down. So, when we design components in React, it's usually good to make a component serve a single purpose. So like this button, right? It displays some text, and when I click on it, it performs some action. That's a good logical grouping to make a component with, right? Like it's a physical button. It's presentational. It does something when you interact with it. That's a good place for a component. Another good place for a component is making things. So when we see this like number pad here, it's going to contain a bunch of the exact same component whose functionality we're repeating and using over and over again. And so we can kind of break this project down into three types of components. We have our components that do something, like our buttons, our components that make other components, like the numbers, or this grouping or this grouping. And then the last kind of component is one that puts everything together. So that's going to be our whole app, right? So we have our small, single function components. We have components that are going to make a bunch of those, and then we have components that are going to arrange everything so it actually shows up on our page. This display here is another component I would consider single purpose. We give it some text and it displays it on our screen. It doesn't need another component, to make it a bunch of times because it only appears once, so we'll use it directly. And that's where I'm going to want to start, partially because just going top down visually, that's the first component that I see, but also because we can do this one quick and we can start getting feedback on our screen about how that's working. So, let's take a look at our project. I'm going to go into the source directory, and then we see all of our files. So app.js is kind of where everything happens. This is the presentational component. We can kind of think of it like our body tag. If something doesn't show up in here, then it's not going to show up on our website. So our goal is to write all of the individual components and then include them in the app.js and then render them. And when we say render, we mean put them in the JSX that this component returns. That's what we mean by rendering. React is going to take the steps necessary to actually translate it into HTML and put it within our web browser. We just have to give it the component inside the JSX so it knows to do that. So the first component that I want to build is the display component. So let's take a look. The way our files are organized is we have this components directory. It's a very common way of doing things. It's the same way we did it when we wrote vanilla components. Inside of there we can have more folders organizing all of these components. So I'm interested in display components and this display.js. We see a few things. First, we import React. We're always going to have to import React when we're writing components, otherwise it won't let us use JSX. We define our component, which is a function, and then we need to export this component. Because I'm going to want to use it in another file, this is display not default, I'm going to want to use it in another file, so I have to export it. So then we're allowed to import it from another file. And now I need to define what this display does. So the idea here is that we want this display to take in some data via props and display that inside of this little window. So what we want to do is to have this display take in data. In React, that always happens through props. Props is always going to be an object that is a collection of all of the attribute-like things we write on our component. So let me get app.js up 2 on the bottom. So when we write div class name equals app, this is a prop, right? And this would translate into the props object of this object having a key called class name, and that key having a value called app. So I'm going to, right now, render my display component, just to try to get something on the screen. So I'm going to import that component. I'm going to import display from, and now we have to specify the path. Okay, this is going to use relative paths, and I know I'm kind of jumping around on my discussion of props. We'll get there. I probably should have done this first. So what a relative path means is we talk about from where we currently are. That's what // means. // means my current directory. So it's the directory my app.js file is in. Most of our text editors are nice enough that when we start writing paths, it will tell us what's happening in there. So from my directory, which is, inside of source, this top level directory when we write our React projects, I'm going to go into components, I'm going to go into display components, and then I'm going to get display.js. So now I can use this component that I've written. How do I use it? Inside of my JSX. I can use components I've written like any other tag. Our default divs, buttons, spans, A tags. We can use our components exactly like that. That's the nice thing about JSX is, this all looks familiar. So when I save this page, my React project should update. And if I look in the HTML, we should be able to find it. So if we look inside of our root, which is where our React app is going to render, we're going to find the app, and then we see this empty div in there. Yeah, that's my display. I can add a class name if we want to verify that that is indeed what we're seeing. Yay, that's our div, right? We're rendering this display component. So now I want to give it data. I want it to, show some numbers that's going to appear on the screen. The way we do that is we decide on the name for the prop, and then we give it a value. I'm going to make it 0, let's say. So now nothing shows up because I've given display this data, but I haven't used it. So if I go up here and I console log props, we're going to see in our console that this props is an object, and the object has a key called number, and it has a value of 0, right? This is exactly what this translates into. Number is the key, and then the right-hand side, 0, is the value. Display is a function, right? Display is a function. That's what it is. We keep calling it a component because that's how it works within our React ecosystem, but it's a function. So this code is essentially equivalent to this. Display is a function, so I can call it like a function, but it requires a single argument called props, and that's an object. And that object contains keys, in this case number, and those keys have values that are 0. Should you ever write this line of code inside of your React app? No. Please do not. You will get weird looks, and eventually you're going to say I taught it to you, and then I'm going to get blamed. I want this here because I want you to realize what's happening with our props. If I add another prop, like, something else, and set this equal to a string, let's call it hello, then we're going to see that now my props object has a key called something else and a value called hello. And that would be the same as doing right here, something else, hello. All of the props that we write end up inside this object. with the left-hand side being the key and the right-hand side being the value. But we get to write them like attributes, just like we would in our normal HTML. And that's how we pass data to React components. That's the only way, at least for now, we're going to pass data to React components, is through props. So now my display has this number. I can get rid of my other prop. I want to use it. So props is an object, so I should be able to do props dot number. There we go. Now I got my 0, right? Props is an object, just like any normal object in JavaScript. And when we do props dot the name of our key, we get the value of that key in our object. So if I want to display it, I can open up some curly braces because I'm about to run JavaScript. Then I'm going to do props dot number. There we have it. Something on our page. We've done it. We've written our first component using props. So now I can change this number to whatever I want. Say 1024, my favorite number. And now that shows up on our page, and that's changed within our props object. Right? Wonderful. I also saw some confusion yesterday with these comments. We can't write comments inside of JSX because it's going to interpret those as text that we want to show up. So we open up a set of curly braces to get a JavaScript environment, and then we can write JavaScript comments. So we didn't necessarily have to do everything within the set of curly braces with this comment in here, but if we do want to write a comment, it does have to go inside of curly braces. So.
Hey, question, Henry.
Yes.
Hey, can we use HTML comments in JSX?
I don't believe HTML comments work inside of JSX.
Gotcha.
Yeah. We would use these JavaScript comments. All right. Any other questions with what we have here so far? No? We're all feeling good with this? Feeling good with how props work? Okay. Cool. So now I want to write my other components. If we look back at our design view, we've gotten the display out of the way. But now I want to tackle this numbers, this setup of numbers. So again, we're going to break this down into two components. One is these buttons, right? It's a single purpose, a nice little unit that we want to reuse over and over again. That's a perfect use case for a component, you know, this button. And then I have a bunch of them, and they're all the same, except for this 0, but that's CSS. They're all the same in terms of, you know, what they do when we click on them, even though we're not actually going to implement that, although we will if there's time. They're all the same in how they work. And so we want to write those buttons into their own component. And then we want to write another component, a component that makes all of those buttons. You know, that's another logical unit we can extract from this, is all of these keys and then this keypad. All of these number buttons and then our numbers component. Well, if we take a look at our files, inside of the components directory, now we have button components. So let's look in there. Now we see number buttons. Alright, so this is where we're going to handle all of these numbers. And I can see that we also have buttons for the operators and then our special buttons here. So those are probably going to end up being pretty similar. Alright. First, I want to make my button. Right? I know what I want my button to do. I want it to display some text. And that's it, at least for now. So I'm going to go into number button. And I want to create a component that I give it some text via props, and then it's going to give me back a button that has that text in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a button tag. I want to take a brief aside here because these empty tags, while they look super weird, those are valid JSX syntax. We call that a fragment. So I could write other tags, other JSX inside of here. The idea behind a fragment is it lets us group up a bunch of our JSX into a group without having to put it like inside of a div. You know, I don't want to wrap these multiple elements inside of a div, but I want my component to return both of them. I can use a fragment to do that. In this case, I'm going to return a single element, so I'm just going to use that. So this is a button, and I want it to take some props, right? I want it to take in some data that it's going to display, and I want to display it. So I would use my props object, and I would get out whatever I want that data to be. So what do I want to call this prop? You know what? I'm going to decide to call it text. Right? I'm going to decide to call this prop text. Like arguments to functions, we can call our props whatever name we want to. So now I'm going to open up the numbers.js. I've written the component for my button. Right? It takes in text, gives me a button. Now I want to write a component to make all of my buttons. We have our little unit components that do things. We have components that make other ones of those components. Then we have other components that will display all of them together. It's a good way to break this down. So here I have my numbers. What I want this to do is make a bunch of number buttons. So I'm going to need to import my number buttons. So let's import number button from, this case, we're using a relative path. When we write these paths here, they're relative to where our file currently is. My numbers.js is in the number buttons directory. So is numberbutton.js. So they're going to be in the same place. They're in the same directory, which is our current directory. So /, and then I'm going to get my numberbutton.js. Now I've made a mistake here, but I want to show it to you because I'm sure you're going to run into the same thing more than once. So I have my number button component. Let's see what happens when I try to use it. Why aren't you giving me... Oh, okay. So it's not giving me my error yet because I'm not trying to put these components on my page. So React isn't bothering to render them. So it's not bothering to run the file. So as long as all my syntax is valid, I'm not going to see any errors yet. So if I want to start this debugging process early, I can put them onto my page so I can see what I'm doing as I work on them. So I'm going to go into my app.js. I am going to import numbers from components, button components, number buttons, numbers. And then I'm going to put it onto my page. And I've made the same mistake here. Failed to compile. React sometimes has some very cryptic error messages, and sometimes it has some very good error messages. So here I get one, and it says attempted to import numberbutton.js does not contain a default export. So what this is telling me is I'm trying to import my number button, but I never actually exported that. So I can add to the bottom export default number button. Okay, I get the same error again. Attempted import error. I attempted to import numbers.js, but it doesn't contain a default export. So I'm going to switch over to my numbers, and I'm going to export that. Great. And now my error messages go away, and we can see I actually have a little button right here. That's because I put it inside of my numbers. I didn't give it any text, so there isn't any text, but I do have a button showing up. And that's progress. Right? We're making progress, we're getting things to show up, we're doing our errors one at a time, rather than writing this all and then trying to include it and suddenly getting a whole bunch of errors, and then realizing we've been doing it wrong the whole time. So, now I want to read some of these instructions. So, I could make all of these buttons individually, all 10 of them, but we as developers at this point should be starting to develop an intuition that there's a better way of doing that than doing it manually. We want to try not to repeat ourselves. So this is a good case where we're like, well, I have a lot of tools in my toolbox to do things a repeated number of times, but what's the one I want to use here? So our steps tell us to go look and import the array data from the provided data file. So in the source file of our project, we have this file called data.js. And it contains all of our numbers in here. So this is what I'm going to want to import, and I can use this to make all of those number buttons instead of typing them out manually. If I want to import this into my numbers.js, I'm going to have to export it from data.js. Previously, we would be using default exports, which allows us to just put this name right here and it works. But I'm also going to want to export all of these other variables, specials, operators, as well as numbers. So we use a normal export. We don't say default. This is going to be a named import. So instead of being able to specify whatever name we want here, I can rename this to whatever I want. We have to use the name of this exact variable that we exported. So I'm going to say import numbers in between curly braces from, and then I need the path to that file. This is going to be a relative path, relative to where I currently am, which is in numbers.js. So that's a couple layers down from where data is. So this works just like when we type paths on our command line. We can go up one level by doing cd ... Right? That's what we do to move up a level on the command line. And that's because ... literally represents the directory that is the next layer up. So what we can do in these paths is we can do ... and that'll give me one directory up. So now I'm inside of components instead of being inside of number buttons. If I do ... again, or I'm sorry, this puts me in button components. If I do ... again, now I get into components. If I do ... again, now I'm in my source, and I can see data.js is right here. So now I have my numbers using this named import syntax. I want to export multiple things from this data file, so I use just the export keyword, and then I have to specify the name of the variable or function that I want to import. So now I have access to that. The directions then say to add this data to state. Okay, we know how to do that. We know how to do that from Monday. We're going to use our useState hook, and we're going to say, okay, I'm going to call these, button numbers. And then set button numbers. I'm going to set this equal to useState, and I'm going to give it some default data, which is going to be our numbers. Now I'm getting this error because useState isn't defined, so I need to go and import it. Notice that we use this named import syntax for useState. And that's exactly what we're doing. React is the main thing. It's the default export that the React library is exporting. But there's lots of other functions and doodads that we can get from React. And we do that with named imports. Right? Same syntax. If we want to do both, we have to separate it with this comma here. So now I have these numbers inside of my state. Step 3. I want to map over this array and return a button component for each one of these numbers. I talked before about expressions. So when we open up a set of curly braces to do JavaScript in here, what we put in here is expressions. We want some code that's going to be run, and it's going to translate into a value that we can then put inside of our document. Right? We can also think of expressions as stuff we'd put on the right-hand side of an equal sign when we're assigning a variable. So we know that map returns an array. It's an expression. It gives us back data. We could do, const, a variable name is equal to something.map. We wouldn't do a for loop. We would never do like const variable equals a for loop, because like what would that even look like? So map is going to be our tool to make a whole bunch of components at once, because it's an expression. And React is nice enough to know how to automatically handle an array full of components. It will just take them and put them all into our page. So that's great. We can use this map to constantly, throughout all of our React projects, make a whole bunch of components based on our input data. And this is one of the reasons why we stress so much these array methods, not only because they're very useful and powerful, but it's how we do this in the React world because of the necessity of how this curly brace expression works. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get my button numbers, which is an array. I'm going to map over it. And so when we do a map, we give it a callback function that takes one element from our array and then returns some value to be, put in the output array. So I'm going to take in a number, and then what am I going to output? This may look weird, but we can use JSX inside of our curly braces. There's no reason why we can't. We can do it anywhere inside of our component functions. We tend to do it inside of return because that's where we want to return JSX, but I can do it right in here. So I can make a number button component inside of this callback function. Looks pretty weird, but we're going to be doing this a lot. We're going to get comfortable with this. This is how we use maps to create components, is we just make a component, and it works. So now I'm going to delete the stray one that I have down here, and I'm going to see what happens. Okay, so I have a bunch of buttons. You might be able to see, it's hard to see, this just little line is all buttons that have no text inside of them. I'm going to look back at my number buttons, at my number button file. Oh, that's right. This component takes props, and that's how I'm going to tell it what text I want it to display. So in here, I have to give it this prop text, right? Because this is the key that I'm using. Then I have to give it a value, number. Now, I chose the word text actually purposefully because it's different than number. We can use whatever name for these props that we want, right? We're just passing in an object that has text as the key. We can use any name we want. It doesn't have to be number. Maybe it would be helpful if it was number, because that way, it would make more sense that we're passing in this number variable, but they don't have to be the same. The right-hand side is just a value, and the left-hand side is just the name of that key. So I'm going to stick with it being text, because also we have a button that's a period, so that's technically not a number, at least if I remember my math correctly. So now when I hit save, we'll suddenly see we get all of these components, all being rendered with their own text. And that's beautiful. Oh, look at that. I wish I had stuff like this when I was writing normal HTML, because I'm sick of like copy and pasting, stuff I have around. I wish I could write it once and then just use it a whole bunch of times. This is wonderful. So do we have questions about doing this so far?
Hi, I have a question about when you defined numbers
Hmm.
inside of the parentheses before the arrow for the arrow function. I put number in curly brackets,
Hmm.
and then in curly brackets, I just put number into the button. What are the differences between doing the way you just did with nothing in the parentheses for the arrow function, and then putting const button numbers, set button numbers equal to use state numbers?
Okay. I didn't technically have to use this button numbers. I could have skipped this step and then just used my numbers array here, and this would have worked the exact same way. The instructions just told me to put it into the state, and it's kind of a good idea to keep the data that this component is going to depend on in its state, even though we're never going to be changing those button numbers. Um, was your other question then about, having curly braces inside of this callback function? I'm sorry, I didn't quite
Oh,
understand.
actually, sorry, I was actually lost. I was in the wrong file. I was looking at number button JS.
Oh,
Sorry, I
okay.
did it like that instead of numbers. For numbers, I did it the same way that you
Okay.
just.
Great. Yeah. And what
Thanks, sorry.
No, you're good. And just to touch on this again, in case we're rusty with our arrow function syntax, um, first let me get this back. In case we're rusty with our arrow function syntax, this is called an implicit return. When I do my argument list, big arrow, and then some JavaScript, it's going to automatically return what I do here. But if I wrap this in curly braces, then I can define a whole function body where I do multiple things, but now I have to manually return this. I'm going to forget to do that on purpose because I want to show you the error we get. Learning these error messages is very helpful because this one isn't as helpful as some of the other ones if you don't know a lot of the technical terminology. So we get expected an assignment or function call and instead saw an expression. No unused expressions. I don't know what this means, but it gives us a line number. And if I turn on line numbers in my text editor, which I don't normally have, we'll see on line 18, it's referring to here. And we might go, I forgot to return it inside of my map. That's what it's telling me. So some errors, super helpful. Others, not that helpful. But we could also Google that error, and I guarantee one of the first results is going to be a Stack Overflow where someone's talking about map and forgetting to return it. And that will help jog our memory. Googling these error messages is a great first step when we run into them if we don't understand exactly what they're telling us, because we are not the first developer to get this error message unexpectedly. So now I actually see a warning inside my developer console. And I want to talk about this because this is really cool and important. So we see a warning and it says each child in a list should have a unique key prompt. And it gives us this link to documentation about what this warning means. And it also tells me this is occurring on line 18 of my numbers.js. So what this means is we're making a whole bunch of components. And what React wants us to do is give them all a property called key that is a unique value for each of the components inside this list. That way, React knows which one is which. So if we do something like delete one of them, React will know which one had gotten deleted based on these keys. It's something that React does to help it efficiently keep track of all of these components that we've made inside of this list. So to get this warning to go away, we just have to do exactly what it says. It wants us to give it a property, a prop called key, and this needs to be a unique value for each one of these components. So what's a unique value that's going to be different for every one of these buttons? Well, the number is. So let's see. It worked. I no longer got my warning. So we hit time here. If any of you want to go, work on your projects, I highly recommend you go do that. I'm going to keep going forward on this project so that, the recording will cover everything. But, we are now in project time, so I don't want to steal away, um, you know, your effort and time on that. This is not as important, but I'm going to keep going for the sake of the recording, and if any of you want to stick around, you're more than welcome to. So, do we have any questions with this key thing? No? Feeling good about keys? Okay. So, now I've got all my buttons. They're showing up on my page. I gotta repeat this process for my operators and my special buttons. And we're gonna see it's very, very, very similar. So, I'm going to go up and over into my operators.js. I'm going to start here, and I'm going to export this. And as my first step, I'm going to include it in my app. I'm going to import operators from components, button components, operator buttons, operators. This way, as I'm working, I'll get any errors that are happening in real time. So I'm going to add my operators. Okay, nothing shows up, but that's because I didn't do anything in here. So I'm going to do this top-down this time. The last component I did bottom-up. I wrote my button first, and then I wrote my component that makes all the buttons. I'm going to write this one first. So here, I'm going to want to import my button. And I'm going to assume that I've written it for now. I'm going to use it like it's been implemented, even though I have to go out and do that, because this is going to inform me, well, what prop should this take? This top-down approach is another way to clarify some of what I want operator buttons to do. So I'm going to import that, and then I'm also going to need to import the data to make all of my operators. Now, what I saw a lot yesterday was people doing import operators from using our relative path, // data.js, and just heading forward without looking back in that data file. Well, first we're going to need to export this, but now we notice this is no longer an array of strings. This is an array of objects. I'm going to forget this on purpose in a little bit. We're going to get an error message. We're going to talk through what it means and how to solve it. So I import my operators, and then now I want to map over this array to make all of my operator button components. So what I'm going to do is, let me see what was that? Okay, I will deal with that in a minute. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to map over our array, and we're going to create all of our operator button components, even though we haven't exactly implemented that, but we're going to do that next. And a storm is happening. If my power suddenly goes out, I'll see you tomorrow. So operators is an array, so we can map over it. I'm going to take in one operator, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make one of my operator buttons, and I'm going to give it a prop, and I want to give it this operator. So what am I going to call this prop? I'm just going to call it operator. Don't have to be creative. We can name this left-hand side prop anything we want, anything in the whole wide world. It's a banana name. We could call it banana. But I'm choosing to keep it consistent just so it's easier for me to remember as I'm jumping between all of these files. So I'm going to save this, and right away we get an error. That's because we included this component in our app, so React is trying to render it, and it's failing, so I get my error right away. Again, it's one of our helpful errors. When we're importing operator button, not seeing an export in that file. So let me jump over there. Let me jump over into my operator button. Yep, I didn't export it. So I'm going to export my component. Now the error goes away, and nothing shows up because this operator button hasn't been implemented yet. Let's do that. We're going to accept props as argument, and I'm going to console log my props. Until you feel super comfortable with props, just always console log your props, right? It's one of the most helpful steps of debugging is to console log all of your data to make sure it is exactly what you think it is. So it causes a lot of our problems when we're just writing functions normally, but especially in React when we're unfamiliar with how props work. So now I'm going to make my button, and I want it to contain my operator. So I'm going to put that right here, props.operator. I'm going to save my file, because this is exactly what I did with the number buttons. I'm going to save this, and now I get an error. And this is one of those errors that isn't as obvious to me what's causing this issue. It says objects are not valid as React children. If you mean to render a collection of children, use an array instead. I don't know exactly what that means, but it's going to give me a line number. We should always look for these line numbers and try to see what code is causing this problem. So it's on line 6, so that's my button component. What did I do wrong in my button component? I'm not sure. The only data I'm trying to render is my operator, but I think that's right. Let me double check my prompts that I had console logged and see what's happening in there. If we look, operator is an object. That's why I'm getting that error. I am trying to render an object here. And React can only handle our basic primitive data types in JavaScript, things like numbers and strings. It doesn't know what to do with an object. So what I have to do is I have to go inside of this object and get my char, because that's the actual string I want to display on my page. So I'm going to do operator.char. And now my error goes away, and I get all of my operator buttons. Awesome. Now I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. I'm going to go and do these with special buttons. So in special buttons, I'm going to look inside of my specials.js. I'm going to export this specials. And this is a lot of jumping around between files, but most of the time you're going to be making all of these files yourself one at a time, so it isn't necessarily going to feel as much of a hectic back and forth. But we do have a lot of files going on. So now I'm going to go into app.js because I want to import my specials component. Button components, special buttons, specials. And then I'm going to render that onto my page. Nothing shows up because I haven't implemented it, but no errors. So let's take the next step in specials. I need to get the data to make all of my special buttons. So I'm going to flip over to data. I'm going to export this specials array. And this is just an array of string, so we don't need to do anything fancy here. I'm going to import that data. Import specials with a named import from ... data.js. Great. Now I want to make all of my components. To do that, I need to import the special button from ... special button.js. In that file, I'm going to need to make sure to export that component. I'm going to do it correctly this time. I'm going to export default special button. So now I can import it in this file. And then I'm going to use it. So I'm going to do, inside of curly braces, specials.map. I'm going to take one of those special characters, and I'm going to create one of my special buttons, and I'm going to give it, let's do text again as our prop name. Because again, we can name this whatever we want. I like it being called text because that's clear, you know, what it does. So let's call this text. And then this is all set up to make all of those buttons. Now I actually have to implement the buttons. We want to give these buttons data, so they accept props as an argument. Our components always accept props, and props is always an object. Let's console log our props to see what's up. If we look, we're going to see there's these objects. It has a key called text and a value of whatever special button text we have in there. Perfect. So now I can make my button, and I can display that prop. Props.text. Now I get all of my special buttons. And so this is it as far as writing Rant components on this project. We were working in a lot of different files, and it was confusing to make sure we had all of our imports right, doing the right paths, exporting everything from all the files. Doing the map is weird the first couple times you do it, but ultimately I really didn't have to write that many lines of code. I just had to write the correct lines of code in the correct files, and that was the hard part. So, do we have questions about this?
Henry, do you know why I would have extra semicolons everywhere on my calculator?
You probably, inside of these parentheses, or you probably, I'm sorry, outside of these curly braces, you were being a good JavaScript developer and you were trying to end the line of JavaScript you wrote with a semicolon, but you accidentally just put a semicolon into the document.
Okay, thank you.
Probably something like that. All right, any other questions with this?
Yeah, I think I got one.
Mm-hmm.
So this right here is how you will put the props in, because I think I did it wrong. I put my props, I forgot. But it was something like this, but the way you did it, I don't think I did that way.
Okay.
But when I was talking to you about it, I did get the click, the on click to display in the console. I did get that. But then I think there was something else I was doing wrong. But now after watching this now, I mean, you told me that you cannot put a on click on a component.
Yes.
So now I see that all this has to be done like within the button.js file, and then I can display it on the app.js component. And if I have, I guess what you got here, the attribute, if I have, because I can look at mine again, but I forgot how I wrote it.
I can go through real fast how we would start to write this as, you know, a working calculator by, you know, passing down functions so that our buttons do something when we click on them. And I see your question, Jay. I'm just going to do this real fast, and then we'll get to that. So we want our buttons to do something when they're clicked on. So that should be easy enough, hypothetically, is going into our number button and adding an onClick attribute to this button, so when it's clicked on, we run a function, and in this case, I'm just going to console.log. Let's console.log this button's text. So when I click on each one of these buttons, we're going to see that show up in the console. But the issue is, I want these buttons to affect what we're displaying in our display component, right? And our display component, it's getting its data from app.js. So the idea here would be, oh, well, I can I can put this number, or this text, because we're going to use a string, inside of a stateful variable. I can do it with useState. And then I can pass down a function to change this number down all the way to my buttons. So we're going to do that right now. So I'm going to, up here, I'm going to make a new stateful variable, and let's call it display value. I don't know. Naming things is hard. You don't pay me to name things. And then I'm going to use useState, and I'm just going to make it be 0 for the start. And the reason we're using strings we're going to see in a bit. So I need to import useState because I was getting that friendly error that was telling me that useState wasn't defined. I can spell it correctly. So now I have this inside of this variable, and instead of giving display always 1024, I'm going to give it the display value. So now it says 0. So the idea is now, when I click on my buttons, I want them to add numbers to this value. I want them to add numbers to that value. So what I could do is I could pass my setDisplayValue function down to numbers. But I don't think that's really good practice. Generally, we want to make our components dumb. And what I mean by that is we want them to be concerned only with their immediate functionality. So I don't want my buttons to be concerned with how they implement adding a button onto the right-hand side of this stateful variable. I just want them, when clicked, to do that. I don't want them to know how it's implemented. I want to make my buttons dumb so that if I, change how I'm handling state, I can do all of that in app.js and my button will never know the difference. Generally, it's a good idea when we're making state to write the functions that are going to affect that state right next to it, not inside of some other component that we've passed setDisplayValue down to. So I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to define a function, and I'm going to call it addNumber. And this is going to be a function that's going to take in a number as an argument, and then what it's going to do is it's going to set our display value, and it's going to add to the display value the number on the right hand side. And I'm going to use this callback form of my my set display value. Whenever we have our set state things, we can give them two different kinds of arguments. We can give them the value that we want to be put inside our stateful variable, or we can give them a callback function that will give us the most up-to-date value of a display value. So I'm going to give it this function that's going to give me the updated value of display value, and I'm going to add my number to the right-hand side of that. So now I put all my logic here. I didn't write this in my button. My button doesn't know how this works, but it knows that it can call this. So now we need to get this down onto the button. The problem that you had, Andre, was that not like cleverly you thought, oh, I can add this special on-click prop here, right? The problem is that we can't add on-click directly to our components because, we don't click on a component. We end up clicking on the stuff that shows up in our HTML, the divs, the buttons, the spans, the A tags. So we have to put this on-click pop directly on those tags. I can still use this as a prop name. I had said before, we can name our prop name whatever we want. We are the masters here. We can name this whatever we want, but it's not going to do the special meaning that onClick normally has. So I'm going to choose to rename this just so I don't get confused about what it's doing. And I'm going to make it the same value as the function name I'm doing, just so I don't get confused. So now what I can do is I can do this thing that we're going to do a lot in React that can get confusing, which is we're going to pass props down through multiple layers of components. Because I'm giving this to numbers, because that's what in app.js, that's what I have access to. But I need to get this down to my number button. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to accept props inside my numbers component, and let's console.log the props here. I'm going to see inside of these props, I'm going to see this object here, and it's going to have the add number as a key, and then it's going to have a value of this function that I passed down. So what I can do is I can use that as a prop for number button. So I can give this a prop called add number, and I can set its value equal to props.addNumber. So now we're passing props down through multiple levels of components, and this is really confusing when you start writing React. It's really confusing. But now, if I go into number button, and I console.log the props here, we'll see indeed that inside of these number buttons, we have an object that has a key called addNumber, and it has a value of that function. So now what I can do is I can use that inside of this actual button element's onClick property. So I can do props.addButton, and I'm going to give it the number, the text of my current button. So we've passed this down through this multiple levels, but now when I click on this, okay, so this is good. I'm getting an error. Alright, where did I make a mistake? I'm getting, it's because I wrote add button here, not add number. So now, when I click on these buttons, it's going to add a number to the right-hand side of that display value, because that's what the function does when I defined it up in app.js. And I passed it all the way down to my numbers. And now I'm able to use it. And does it work perfectly? No, because I can add a bunch of periods and stuff. But these are the problems that we would have to start solving, once we get this framework down of writing these functions in app and then passing them down to our buttons. Does that answer your question, Andre?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. All right. Jay, you also had a question.
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple. I just want to, you've said a couple of times that in the app.js file, for example, display numbers and operators are functions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, can you actually, yeah, perfect. So it's still up the way it is on your screen. Is that because in React, all those things are just by their nature functions, or is that because within number button, for example, we have actually declared an arrow function, thereby making that component a function?
Yeah, the second one is what I mean. So like this, the variable number button that we're defining and exporting is literally a function. That's what we mean when we're saying we're writing function components, is we're implementing these components as functions. And React supports both function components and class-based components. We will learn class-based components, but right now we're learning how to write them as functions. And so these are functions. React, when it unravels this JSX syntax that we're using, it's ultimately going to call these functions. That's how it's implemented under the hood. But we just write them in this JSX syntax that can sometimes mask to us, what we're actually doing, which is going to be that we're calling this function with an argument of props that is an object containing all of the props that we had added to our component.
Perfect. Just wanted to confirm that that was the case. Thank you very much. Super clear.
Awesome. Okay. Do we have any other questions here? No? We feel good? Do you feel like if you restarted the project from yesterday, you could get through it with no problem? Or what do you think your sticking point would be?
Hey, Henry, could you actually recap why it is that you declared add number in app.js and also in numbers?
Oh, okay, yeah. So I declared app number inside of app.js because this is where I have access to my set display value function, which is what I'm going to need ultimately in order to change the value displayed on my page here. That's what I'm going to need to change that. So we can instead pass down this set display value function down to the button and then write our add number function in there, and it would work exactly the same. But I consider that largely bad practice, because then right now the way we have it written is numbers takes in this add number function, so I can just tell from looking at this one line exactly what my numbers component is going to do. The only thing it can do right now to change the state of my page is to add a number onto the end of my display. If I had just given it the set display value function, then I have no idea what it's going to go out and do with that. You know, it could reset the display, it could, you know, do a whole bunch of other things. So that's why I like declaring it right up here and then giving that component this function instead of writing that function inside of this component. What we have to do, the reality of giving this numbers component add number is a prop, is that now my numbers component has access to that function, but not my number button. The number button is the thing that needs to run that function when clicked on. So I'm not declaring this function again inside of numbers. What I'm doing is I'm getting it outside of my props, because I added this as a prop to my numbers component. So now I can access it with props.addNumber. Right, this is one of the arguments to my numbers component is this add number. So I can get it out of props. And now I can give it to my number button, which is going to be the component that actually uses this. So inside of my number button, let me do it up here, inside of my number button, I can also access that function out of my props because I passed it down when I made this component inside of numbers. And so now I can actually call that function and give it the text necessary so that when it's clicked on, we actually see that number getting added to our display value. Does that clear things up?
I think so, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so we pass these props down multiple levels. And it can be a bit weird, but that's how we do things in React. All right. Any other questions with this?
I have a question.
Mhm.
If we wanted to get this calculator functionality fully working, would we want to set our state variables in app.js instead of in numbers, operators, and specials?
So we can do this. We can get this working real fast. Thanks to one of my other students who showed me a much easier way of doing this, we're most of the way there already. So what we want is we do want to hold all of our state inside of app.js, because in React we can put state inside of whatever component we want, and we often should, but the issue is we can only pass data one way, and that's down through props. And we can use tricks to get data back up. Like when I'm calling this add number function, I'm giving it this props.text value, but there's no way for me to pass props up directly. So if I have state that needs to be shared between my display component and my numbers component, then I'm going to need to have that state be declared inside of app, because it has to be high enough in the tree of our components to be able to pass each of those components the state necessary for it to function. In our small apps, that's generally going to mean doing it inside of app.js. When we start writing React components that have multiple pages, for example, the level high enough to get the data everywhere we need to go might be inside of, one of our components that represents that entire page. But for now, it's largely going to mean inside of app. But if there's state that only one function cares about, or one component cares about, for example, in numbers, it's fine for me to make button numbers in here because no other component is going to care about this data. So it's totally okay for me to do that in here. But stuff I need to share has to be high enough so I can physically pass it around as props. So in this case, the number that we're displaying on the screen is going to have to be in app.js because we need to pass it to both these components. So what we're going to do to make the, or I'm sorry, Lily, does that answer the first part of your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to make use of a function in JavaScript called eval. And this is a dangerous function we probably should not use very often. Because what it does is we give it a string that is valid JavaScript, and then eval runs it. Okay, and this is dangerous because if we're allowing users to input stuff that then gets called with eval, we're starting to give them the ability to execute arbitrary code. Is this super dangerous for them to do in their own browsers? Not really, but if we do this on the server side, then we can start entering uh-oh town, which is the technical terminology for making this kind of oopsie. So we're going to use eval here, and there's other ways of doing this calculator so that it works more like a normal calculator, but this is going to allow us to do it quickly and then adapt from there. It can be important to get something working first and then making it better rather than sitting here and going like, oh, how do I do this the best way possible? That's not always helpful. So sometimes we gotta get our hands dirty and then fix what's broken. So I'm going to add another function here. Then instead of adding a number, is going to add one of my operators when it's clicked on. So I'm going to do const add operator, and it's going to take in an operator. What it's going to do is it's going to set the display value to be the display value with an operator on the right, and I'm going to add in some spaces just so it looks nice visually. Operator, and then I'm going to add another space. Could I have used a template string to do this? Yes. Did I not? Yeah, I just didn't. So now I can pass this down to my operators component. So I'm going to give it a prop called add operator. I could have called this whatever I wanted, but I'm just keeping it consistent, so it makes more sense to me. And then inside of here, I'm going to go into my operators component. I'm going to get that as a prop. So I have to add my props value as an argument to my component. And then I'm going to pass the add operator down as a prop to the operator button, because that's what I want it to do stuff when clicked on. So I'm going to give this a prop called add operator and set this equal to the add operator from my props. Okay, so now inside of operator button, I can use that from my props. So I can add an on click to this button. So when it's clicked on, it's going to call the props.addOperator function, and it's going to give it my props.operator dot something dot value. Yeah, dot value. because this is the hint that we got from data.js, is that it's giving us these two things. One is the character that we want to display on our calculator. The other is the actual symbol we use to do JavaScript math with it. So that's the hint that we can use eval here. So now, when I press these numbers, it's going to add them to our page. And when I press these operators, it's going to add them too. When I hit equal sign, it's going to insert it, but I don't want that to happen. I want it to actually evaluate my number. This is where we get the benefit of making our components dumb. Is instead of writing the change in the logic inside of my operator button, because this operator button is already doing exactly what I want it to. When I click on it, it runs a function and it gives it the operator. That's really all this component needs to do, right? It's dumb. It's dumb. That's good. But our app is smart. Our app has state in it. Our app has logic in it. So I'm going to add an if statement to my add operator. And it's going to check to see if the operator is an equal sign. If it's not, then I'm going to do what I was doing before. I'm going to add that operator to that. But if it's an equal sign, then I'm going to call eval on display value. And then I'm going to set display value to equal the eval display value. And I can use this callback style to make sure I'm getting the most updated value of display value. It really doesn't matter which one I use here, but whenever we're like depending on the most up-to-date version of this variable, then we can use this just to be sure. So now what happens is I can do 1, 2, 3 plus 4, and when I hit equal, we get a break. Aha. So this is an issue with how I actually implemented the calculator, which is that JavaScript treats numbers that start with zeros as octals, so like base 8 numbers. So if I actually remove this 0 from here, then it should work. 1, 2, 3 plus 4, we get 127. And I can divide that by 6, and I can multiply that by 3, and now we have a working calculator, which is pretty cool. Does our clear button work? No, not yet. Do any of these buttons work? Nope. They don't. But we could keep implementing this functionality inside of app, because that's where we have the display value, and that's what these buttons are going to modify, and then pass them down to the components that are going to invoke them. Those components don't have to be aware of how that logic works, but you know, they have to have access to the function that is going to run that logic. So questions about this? No? We're feeling good? If you were to start this calculator project from scratch, do you think you could do it, including getting this thing working? Or what would probably give you trouble?
The only thing I can say for myself is just seeing it one time, but not repeatedly. Some things I probably would get, and some things I probably wouldn't get. That would go back to like, cause you already showed it, like the display. I had a little bit of it working, but some things I didn't know was like, you know, I got a display, but it wasn't doing it with the clicking, because now that I know that I can't use components as a button because it's not the same as HTML.
Yeah.
I can only use look at on click, because that's
Mm-hmm.
Cards are working. I mean, I got my numbers to work because I guess the way that you wrote it, like with the I guess with the map, my I did it a different way. I use like index, and then I use like the key as the index with the curly braces,
I
and
see.
then the one thing I did get working right, and that I saw was when you did that dot notation with the objects like char
Yeah.
and value. So I came back this morning and I put in dot char because I know dot value is going to be used later. So I did dot char and it still worked.
Nice.
So I was able to pull it up, but that's as far as I got, with that part right
Yeah.
there. But the display part was giving me the hang up.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are a lot of gotchas in here. I'm gonna give some advice of something that's worked for me is I used to study physics, and before every test, what I would do is I would gather up all the examples that the professor did in lecture, and all of the homework problems I had, and all of the past tests I could find. But the important thing was that I had solutions. I had the solution the professor did in class. I had the solution I did from my homework. I had, you know, the the solutions to the back exams. And what I would do is I would try to solve these problems again. And as soon as I would get stuck, I would spend like 30 seconds trying to think through it. And if I didn't know, then I would go and I would reference the solution. And I'd say, oh, yes, that's how that works. And then I'd keep going. And I'd get stuck again and I'd look at the solution. And I'd work through all of these problems. But when I got to the end, I would start over. And so I would work on the first problem again. And this time I may not get stuck in the same place. But the idea was this repetition of trying to solve the problem from scratch, but then having the answers available. So if you have time, and I know Lambda, we move at a breakneck speed, so there's not always time to go back and practice old projects. But if you have one that gave you a lot of trouble during the week, sit down with a fresh copy of the project and the solution code in another window but minimized, and try to do the project from scratch. And when you get stuck, look at the solution, try to figure out the problem until you're done. And then when you're done, start over and repeat it until you feel like I know how to do all of this. In fact, this has become very boring because I know exactly what I'm going to type before I type it. Because that's the level of understanding, that is going to let you be able to do these projects like the way I did, where I just kind of roll through it start to finish, is feeling comfortable enough that you know exactly what you're going to type before you do it. And that may not work for everyone, but that's something that I like doing.
I see what you're saying, but that's the $1 million question for me is like, how many times do I do it until I get it? That's this plays in my head over and over again because when I'm seeing everybody like how they, especially even with tutorials, it's like how they move through it, like how they do this, and then I watch y'all. It's like, okay, cause I know y'all been doing it for years. It's like, what's the level of practice to get it? Like, what's the amount to do? Because that's the part I'm trying to figure out. Like, I know it's gonna take more than one time.
Yeah.
I know it's gonna take more than two times. So it's like trying to find out my level. The practiceness is like until I can get it.
Yeah.
It won't have to be boring. It's just like when I see it again, oh, I remember.
Yeah. And that's
that
why.
Moment. Like, okay, I'm seeing it now. I'm seeing it.
Yeah. And so that's why in this program, we give you lots of opportunities to practice. We're doing 2 units on React now, so that's 2 months. Every day we're going to be making a new React project and doing it start to finish. And so we're going to get a lot of practice in there. So the goal from the program, you should end up in the same spot that all the TLs are in right now, which is that, we feel comfortable doing these projects in, maybe an hour, maybe less than an hour. You're going to get that practice in. But for now, when you're stuck on things that you're having trouble with, doing a bit of extra practice is going to pay dividends because we're going to keep building on what we're knowing. So right now, you don't have to practice until you could do it blindfolded. That's not necessary. But if you have extra time, start getting those reps in. And you don't have to be, superhuman with it yet. because you're going to keep doing it over and over in class. So I would say do it, when you have the free time to do it. Don't do it until you hate it. Like you need to have a life outside of coding too. Lambda takes so much of your time. You shouldn't have to spend all of your nights and weekends, staying up late coding. But if you do have free time, try to code every day. Even if it's just for a little bit. Same like learning any other language. You want to practice every day. You want to try to be immersed in it. So just get the extra practice that you can, and don't stress out too much about what's the right amount, because you're going to get there. When you make it through this program, you will have enough practice, because you wouldn't have passed the sprints if you didn't. So, yeah.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? I'm starting to eat up a lot of the project time, so I think I'm going to call this quits before I do the CSS. But if I have time, I'll record a video about doing the CSS at a later point for everyone.
Hey, Henry,
Yeah.
question about the CSS.
Mhm.
Since I wasn't here yesterday, we're going to be using SASS, right?
Oh, yeah, this is a great point. I do want to show how to use the different types of styling we can do in React. Thank you, Tommy, for bringing this up. So we don't have to use Sass. If we look at the top of our app.js, we see this line, and we're importing a normal CSS file. And we can see this is just a normal CSS file. And I can do things like I have a class named app on this div, so I can get this app div, and I can set the background color to be, black, or let's do red, because our calculator's red. Now it's red. And this is just normal CSS. If we want to do like the nested selectors and stuff that we're familiar with from Less, right now it's easier to set up Sass than it is Less in React's projects. And the only real difference we're concerned with at this point between Less and Sass is if you use an @ symbol in Less, you use a $sign in Sass. The important part is that we get to write these nested selectors, and it'll still work. So the way we do that is, instead of importing app.css, I'm going to import app.scss. That's the Sass file extension. So then it's going to give me an error because that file is not found. So I'm going to add a new file called app.scss, and I'm going to write, what looks just like Less.
Is there anything to install?
Yes. So I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to get another error, and then I'm going to show what happens then. So I write this, and then I get this weird error, but again, this is where we have helpful error message. It tells me I need to install Node Sass, and it gives me the commands to do that. For most of us, it's going to be yarn add Node Sass. So I would go to my terminal. I would stop the yarn start process by doing Control-C. And then I would do yarn add node-sass. The dash is important. So it's going to add this package. And it's going to take a minute because my internet is slow. But then once this is done, all we have to do is say yarn start again, and it works. The other thing is I can write all of my CSS inside of app.scss, or if I want, I can add more files. So something that we'll do is, like, if I want to style the number buttons, I could absolutely do that by giving them class names and targeting them in app.scss. But if I wanted to, I could go right to my number button component. I could make a file called numberbutton.scss. Write my CSS in here. Number button, background color gray. And then I can import this inside of this file as well. So I could just do import /numberbutton.scss, And now I can write, you know, my CSS for each component right next to its file. So I don't have to go digging through my whole big app.scss. And this is how we get the kind of functionality in less, where we would import all these files together. React is going to take care of that for us. All we have to do is import the file into our component. So now when I do yarn start, I don't want you, Chrome. Now when I do yarn start, I should have all of those changes that I added. And I didn't because I forgot to add a class name to this button. Number button. There we go. And now I can style all of these. I can use my nested selectors. I can use variables, this time with $signs instead of at symbols, but it all still works. So does that clear up how you would use Node Sass?
Listens and compiles, you don't have to tell it to like you do with
Yeah.
Plus.
Yeah, our yarn start process is going to take care of that entire thing. We don't have to run any extra programs. React, it goes through its own compilation step where it like builds all of our JavaScript into a single file. So when they visit the website, like they're just including an index.css. They're not including all of our component files, you know. Builds it down into one file, and during that step it'll also build all of our CSS and put that in one file as well. So thank you, React.
Okay, awesome.
All right. Okay.
I had a question about so I tried Googling how to import React eval, and it just did import and then the curly brackets, and inside of that put ref from React eval. How did you do it? Sorry, I couldn't.
So I didn't use a package to do this. So inside of my app.css, I just used the eval function. Eval is a function built into JavaScript. I don't have to... Oh, sorry, my internet is breaking up a little bit. But eval is just a normal function built into JavaScript. I don't have to import anything to use it. It's just right there for me to use.
Okay, because I have like a squiggly line under it.
When you just do this normal eval, it might give you a squiggly line because it doesn't, your text editor doesn't think it's defined, but it is inside of the browser that's going to be running our JavaScript. I don't need to import anything. If you're getting an error in your import...
Okay. And then
I'm sorry, what was that? My internet is being terrible right now.
Oh, sorry. I had another question. I was wondering if you could go over really quick the different ways to pass props, because I've been doing like, for example, in numbers.js, where it says const numbers equals, and then where you passed in props, I did curly brackets and did add number inside of it.
Yes. So that's...
I was just wondering the different ways. And
so we're not changing how pops are being passed. That's just called destructuring. So I'm going to open up a REPL, which is going to let me run some JavaScript. So we can do destructuring like we do when we use state. So I can say var AB on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, I can do 1, 2. And this will define a variable A to be 1 and B to be 2. We can do a similar thing with objects, where on the left-hand side I do AB, and on the right-hand side I have an object that has a key of A and a key of B. And JavaScript will create the variables A and B with the values 3 and 4. So that's how we do object destructuring. I could do that here on the first line of my file. You'll see it done like this. I could get my add numbers function here and set this equal to props, which is an object. If we really want to be fancy, we can perform this destructuring directly in this argument list. So I never even have to use the word props. But that's what we're doing. We're just getting that value out of that object.
And what way's better, do you think?
I prefer to destructure my props than refer to things with props.whatever, because this way, right at the start of my component, I can see exactly what props it takes. I don't have to be digging through, like what props does this function take if I delete this? It turns out it's props.addNumber, which is one of the last lines in this component. And if this is hundreds of lines long, that's not manageable. So what I like to do is if I have a couple, I'll do it in the argument list. I'll do it right here. Because I just have a couple. But we might be passing 10 props to this, and suddenly this argument list is going to run off the side of our screen. In that case, I will just take props, and then I'll destructure it on the first line, because as we start adding more props, I can then format this nicely, and it'll look better. But
okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. All right, any more questions? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I have a blast doing these. I'll get the YouTube video posted for you to reference later. It's probably going to take a minute to upload because I don't have the best internet, and we're now at like 2 hours. But I'll get that up there. And good luck on your projects today. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.